Bryce Mitchell recently made an appearance on the Jaxxon Podcast, which has since been deleted. And it's the first time Bryce has shown his face since he made controversial remarks on episode 1 of Arc Insanity, Bryce Mitchell's own podcast, which has also been taken down, where he made some questionable remarks. He espoused some beliefs that, were just quite frankly uneducated regarding World War II, the Nazi regime, Adolf Hitler, and a fishing trip. I know sounds insane when you put it like that, but I've already covered that. I've already made a dedicated video on some of the remarks that Bryce Mitchell said. Essentially, he said, man, I sure would like to go fishing with Adolf, man. And them Jews are greedy and they're queering up the kids, man. And then Dana White came out, absolutely crapped on Bryce Mitchell. And then Bryce Mitchell went on the Jaxxon Podcast. And that's kind of where we're going to start at. Because after Dana White absolutely dunked on Bryce Mitchell put out an apology. He said, in the future, I will be much more considerate when talking about suffering of all peoples. Now, this statement right here that I just read to you, I believe Bryce Mitchell most likely wrote that because of the capitalization or lack thereof and the way he's spelling win here. I mean, this is about par for a first grade reading and writing level. And then you have a paragraph. I believe he posted this image on Instagram as well. I'm sorry I sounded insensitive. I definitely was not trying to offend anyone, but I know I did. I know a lot of people died in the Holocaust, and that's a fact. Hitler did a lot of evil things. I think we can all agree on that. I'm definitely not a Nazi and definitely do not condone any of the evil things Hitler did. Bryce Mitchell. Now, this paragraph, it seems like someone a lot smarter than Bryce wrote this paragraph and then tried to dumb it down a little bit to make it believable, maybe like a 6th grade reading and writing level, to make it seem like maybe Bryce wrote this. But my thoughts on this, I have a multitude of thoughts on this apology in itself. It seems forced. It seems kind of like, you guys took me out of context is kind of what I'm getting from it. And I didn't mean to hurt anyone's feelings. And it just seems like a load of horse shit, if I'm being honest. But I will say this, and I don't think I fully expressed this in my first video. I don't know that Bryce Mitchell really means anything malicious. I know that sounds crazy because I'm about to criticize him like crazy. But I think Bryce is just really uneducated, really low IQ. And to be quite frank, and we're going to break down kind of the rationale of the people defending him and criticizing the Jaxxon Podcast. And we're going to break all that down in this video. But to kind of sum it up, Bryce Mitchell is essentially a useful idiot. He doesn't realize what he's doing, but he's brainwashed and he's saying these things and he's platforming these ideas. And then when he gets criticized, he's like, well, I didn't mean nothing by it. And it's just, quite frankly, it's very, very sad because I don't really think he's trying to be malicious, even though he is. And he's really embarrassing himself badly. Now, we jump to the Jaxxon Podcast, which has since been deleted, but luckily the internet's forever. This podcast hasn't been taken down. We're going to start right at the jump. Right at the jump, Rampage Jaxxon goes at Bryce Mitchell's throat. Listen to this.
My first time meeting you, and we from the same area.
All right.
And I got to ask you, what the fuck is wrong with you, brother? We got to talk about this.
Right.
I've been known to say some fucked up shit in my life, and shit I don't mean. I'm a comedian. I like to joke around and stuff like that.
Rampage literally starts off the podcast. That's the beginning of the podcast. What the fuck is wrong with you? And Bryce is like, I feel bad because the answer is really poor education in Arkansas and low IQ. That's really the answer here. Combined with the fact there's people out there trying to brainwash people. Now, we're not going to rehash, the legitimacy of the Holocaust. That's not what we're going to do in this video. We're really going to watch clips from this podcast and react to it. But you know what actually did disturb me? We'll jump back to this apology real quick. There was a very vocal portion of the MMA community and just the online community in general, who were more upset that Bryce Mitchell issued an apology than that were upset for his initial comments, which I think is absolutely crazy. And, I know there's a lot of people out there, whether it be, Twitter personalities or MMA media or MMA content creators that like tiptoe around issues like this because they're trying to navigate, a very touchy topic. I don't care about that. I'm just going to call it like I see it. And I think it's humiliating that there's people out there justifying Bryce Mitchell's comments and getting mad at Bryce Mitchell for apologizing, even though it's a disingenuous apology. But I'm happy that Rampage called him out immediately. Now we're going to jump ahead just a little bit. This is still like the very beginning of the podcast. and Bryce starts really trying to address it. You can tell they kind of talked about it a little bit beforehand. They didn't want to spend too much time on it. And this is where people really start getting upset because, to be quite frank, Bryce Mitchell got bullied here a bit, but I think it's for his own good. Let's listen. Let's listen and react.
It's going viral.
Right, and first off, thank y'all for having me here today. I can tell you're not happy with me just because of your tone. I've watched you since I was a kid, Rampage, so I know I've never seen you that serious before. It's really unfortunate that this is the first time that we meet, but also God has a plan. And I want to spend a very brief amount of time talking about what I said because of the severity of it. I wish I didn't have to talk about it at all, but I feel like the severity of it being this is the first time I've shown my face since I said it. I do want to talk about it. First things first, I said word for word, I do not support, I am not a Nazi. I said it word for word. You can go back and watch it. And
people just clipped up some of the stuff.
I said was a good guy, and then I said after that I said before he committed all the atrocities.
Now, before the guy Bear jumps in, I'd like to jump in myself. Look, you can't say what Bryce is saying and then say, well, I didn't really like him that much. He was a good guy. Like, you can't justify a genocidal maniac who is trying to systematically exterminate an entire race, ethnic group, religion. You can't justify him, especially considering it's not like you knew him as a child. It's not like you're saying, yeah, back when we were teenagers or back when we were, 10 years old, he was a great guy. You don't know him. And then just say, oh, well, I'm not a Nazi, so that makes it okay. And the reason, this is really not okay of Bryce in general is really larger, kind of a larger scale issue, which we'll talk about in a little bit after we kind of finish up with this Jaxxon podcast. But let's continue.
But they didn't play the whole podcast. Okay, so I did say he was a good guy, but I was saying before he committed all the atrocities.
Brother, you don't know.
By the way, also, it's crazy that he's acting like he was taken out of context. If you haven't seen my initial video and go watch it, you can hear the full context. This is not a case of, oh, he was just taken out of context. And luckily, this guy interrupts him. I know a lot of people didn't like it. I believe there's two distinct groups that didn't like that this guy Bear did this, but I'm going to explain the rationale for each one of those groups after we finish up listening to this.
Know him, right? You don't know the severity of what he did to the world. Obviously, I could tell you don't know for you to be able to even relaxedly say that word, that he was a good guy. And I'm not even going to give him the benefit of saying his name, but those extremist ideologies, the things he did to, millions of people are some of the most disgusting, most evil things the world ever seen. Now, we're not going to give you a platform today to talk about anything that even remotely supports that.
No,
we're not going to give you a platform
I don't want
to justify what you said. And matter of fact, and me and Rampage talked about this, we're not even going to give you a platform to explain yourself on that. I personally just feel with the things that he did and the millions of people that died, there's no justification pre or post whatever you did say. Ain't nobody a good guy. And we as people, and me as a fan of MMA, right? As a fighter, I watch all your fights, right? You bring the Bible in the cage.
So a lot of people didn't like that. They said, we're not even going to give you a platform to justify yourself. Matter of fact, we're not even going to give you a platform to explain yourself. And people really didn't like, man, Bryce should have walked off, man, blah, blah, blah. Bryce should have been given an opportunity. There is no justification for saying, you know what, I think I would like to go fishing with old Adolf. There's no justification for that other than, hey, you know what, I'm really ill-informed. I'm really uneducated. I have a really low IQ. And I said it without thinking because I've been brainwashed. That's the only justification. There's no, well, back when he was, 22 years old, he was an avid gardener and he was an artist and, whatever it may be. And people are pissed that this guy cut him off and said, you're not even going to be able to explain yourself. Now, you're going to hear him say it you're going to hear it with your own ears in a second. But Bryce was booked on this podcast months ago. Okay. They've been trying to have him on for a year. They didn't have him on just because recently he went on this diatribe on his own podcast and stirred up this controversy. So for the people to say, why are you even going to have him on if you're not going to have him explain himself? That's like, imagine if Bryce said, he supported pedos. Now, granted, you wouldn't have him on at all because that's just incredibly mentally ill and disturbing and disgusting. But they'd be like, man, let him explain himself. Let him explain himself, man. Makes no sense. And I think even though this guy is the tone is kind of bullying Bryce, it's for Bryce's own good, because Bryce, if he keeps going on this topic, he's just going to dig his hole even deeper and humiliate himself and say something else that's going to garner attention, which is what some people want, but we'll get to that in a second. Let's listen to another minute and a half or so.
You did some amazing things before that podcast. Rampage is an icon to me. I look up to Rampage. So when Rampage gets serious, even when he said, listen, man, I got a full-time Jewish chef. And Rampage, the only reason why he was accepting of even doing this podcast, you know, we already had pre-booked you before that show. And
so there you go. He was already pre-booked. Just because Bryce is on and he made these controversial remarks, can they address them? Sure, they can address them. But they don't need to sit there and talk about it the entire time and have Bryce make a fool of himself just for everyone else's entertainment. They can talk about other topics, which they did throughout this podcast. I didn't like that they kind of went back to it a little bit here and there, which I'm going to show you some other clips from that in a little bit. But this wasn't just booked because, Bryce said these remarks recently and got a lot of attention. Let's get Bryce on the podcast because we know it'll get a lot of views. And obviously, they since took it down. We'll look at Rampage's explanation for that in a little bit, and I'll give you my opinion on that. But let's carry on.
We've been trying to get you on for about a year, right? Mm-hmm. And so Rampage said, I want to be able to see him face to face and explain to him the severity of what he did. Right. So at least if you didn't, you do understand what you did damages people's relationships with their family over arguments, damages society, wasting time on things they shouldn't be talking about. We should be coming together as a world, but we should never justify the persecution and the extremism that we've seen in the past from that man or any sort of that nature, right? So
right, I totally agree, bro.
Which, to be honest, is facts. We shouldn't be justifying that guy. Now, there's going to be people saying, Joey, how could you? Bryce was speaking fact. It's embarrassing the amount of people who are so uneducated that they want to try to justify what Bryce is saying. And then you also have other people who were saying, you know, bringing up the war in the Middle East right now and using that as an example for why Bryce should be able to say what he said. Like, it really makes absolutely no sense. And he's shutting Bryce down because he knows Bryce is going to put his foot in his mouth, which he starts to do it again, and he gets interrupted again here in a second.
Brother, yeah. And that's why I wanted to say, I literally said in my podcast, I don't support.
Yeah.
And I'm not a Nazi. And I said that, and I'm glad that you got to let me repeat that.
How long have you had that podcast?
That was my first episode. And here's the thing, guys, is, you know, before he did all of that stuff is what...
Look, Bryce is trying to choose his words carefully. And all I imagine going on in Bryce's brain right now, it's like that monkey with the tambourine or whatever the hell it's called, you know, just banging them together, the cymbal, whatever the hell it's called. I don't even remember what it's called. I think it's the cymbals. That's all that's going on in his head, that little wind-up toy, the monkey that's banging the cymbals together. And he's like, well, before he was a genocidal maniac, like he knew him, like he grew up with him. Embarrassing. But let's carry on. We got a little bit more to watch from this clip.
What I was talking about, guys.
Yeah, we're not even.
We understand. Listen,
I'm not denying anybody's suffering, bro. Like,
we understand
I'm literally
that.
not denying anybody's suffering.
We understand.
But you do know millions of people, over 5 million people died because of him.
A lot of people.
One of the deadliest wars of all time, World War II. Probably over 50 million people, 3 to 5% of the population died.
Deadliest war, yeah.
Yeah. So you are aware that even trying to justify that, you got to move past that, brother. Right?
No. Listen,
you can't even.
Listen. We understand. We understand. It's your first podcast and stuff.
All right, so that guy Bear just kind of shuts down Bryce Mitchell. And I know people are going to be down in the comments complaining at me. I'm sure they were complaining at him on the episode that was since taken down. But he's trying to save Bryce from himself. And also he's trying not to get his podcast episode ruined because Bryce putting his foot in his mouth and saying certain things that are not particularly going to look great when they come out and cause a lot more controversy for all of them, even though it ended up doing that anyway. And there's a couple more clips we're going to get to. But I want to break this down because I don't feel like anyone's saying this. Okay? There's two sets of people that are upset that this guy interrupted Bryce. The first set of people, more looking for entertainment value. They want Bryce unhinged, saying ridiculous things, crapping on Jewish people and, you know, hyping up Adolf and saying he wants to go fishing with Adolf. And essentially, they just want the entertainment value of Bryce looking like an idiot and the controversy that entails. That's why they're like, man, why'd you interrupt him? Let him explain himself. Which again, he was booked for a year or months in advance, that he doesn't need to sit there and explain horrible comments that he made that were wildly uneducational or uneducated, as I'm stumbling over my own words, Colby Covington style, that are wildly uneducated, wildly ill-informed. He doesn't need to explain that because he's just going to make himself look dumber. Then you have another group of people who love what Bryce is saying for one reason or another. And the reason it's important to kind of shut it down is because these people are happy that Bryce is using his celebrity status, however big or small you want to say Bryce is in terms of celebrity status. He is a UFC fighter. They love seeing someone of some type of status espouse these beliefs because they don't have a platform to do it themselves. So then Bryce can do it and it normalizes it and they can try to amplify it. Like, yeah, man, Bryce is based, bro. Bryce is based, man. Bryce is really speaking his mind, man. These are facts, man. And it's humiliating because it's not. It's just uneducated. It's brainwashed, brain rot. And these people want Bryce to say it because then it gets more attention. Then maybe someone else can get brainwashed. And also it helps normalize their extreme beliefs. And that's what they want. So like, man, if that guy Bear wouldn't have interrupted him, he would have espoused some more of those beliefs. He would have made, man, me and Adolf would have loved to go playing at Dave and Buster's if he was still alive today. If he hadn't ended himself many, many years ago. That's what they want. So it's the group of people that want entertainment. And then it's the group of people that really agree with what Bryce is saying because they're uneducated or brainwashed. And they want him to espouse those beliefs so then they can co-sign them and amplify them online. And then you have other people who maybe have a platform themselves but are too scared to say it themselves for monetary reasons or backlash reasons, so they can use Bryce as an avenue to kind of help push those narratives themselves because they're too worried about saying it themselves, which in the end is just a net negative when you have multiple people trying to push this type of propaganda and uneducated rhetoric about World War II. Now, a couple of the clips we want to look at from this podcast, okay? He gets called out again. I forgot the exact context of this, but I mean, the guy Bear just goes right at Bryce's neck here. And you could tell, I feel bad for Bryce because it is his low IQ. It's almost like picking on someone, you know, that's basically a little kid, like a 12-year-old that's been, you know, indoctrinated essentially. But he really goes at him right here and really says, like, look, I don't even know if I like you after the remarks you made. Listen to this.
Didn't Jesus heal the people who threw stones at him? Didn't Jesus forgive the people who crucified him?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And
so if you have a platform, you have to understand, because my job here today, because I personally was on the fence about doing the podcast. As a fighter, you're phenomenal. The things you said, I don't even know if I like you anymore, but as a fighter, you're phenomenal. Right.
Yeah.
Calls him out. I don't even like you. And I again, I know the majority of the backlash from this podcast has been aimed at this guy. He's trying to tell Bryce, like, look, what you're saying is not okay. What you're saying is uneducated. What you're saying is offensive. And I know there's going to be people like, man, freedom of speech. This actually really drives me nuts. The freedom of speech warriors don't even know what freedom of speech is. Freedom of speech in America, the First Amendment, has to do with your relationship with the government, okay? If Bryce Mitchell continued to espouse these beliefs that he initially espoused on his podcast, if he was thrown in jail, I'd be the first to be out there, you know, picketing, okay, protesting, making a video saying it was disgraceful. Bryce, no one called the cops on Bryce. No one is calling for his arrest. No one is throwing him in jail. That is freedom of speech. This guy, Bear and Rampage, not letting Bryce push out hateful rhetoric on their podcast because it makes them look bad has nothing to do with freedom of speech. Okay, or criticizing Bryce. The people are like, man, how could you're so soft? How could you criticize Bryce? Blah, blah. That has nothing to do with freedom of speech. Me criticizing Bryce is my freedom of speech. What, are you going to throw me in jail for it? It just makes no sense. And there's people that are just like, man, freedom of speech. But I love that this guy says, look, I don't even know if I like you. You embarrassed yourself for, like, look what you're doing. And you're basically a hypocrite. You know, you claim to be this good Christian. You bring the Bible into the cage. And look what you're saying about a genocidal maniac, a war criminal, a piece of shit in history, one of the worst people in the history of the world. And you want to take time on your podcast to hype up a dude you never met? who's one of the worst people in the history of the world. So he calls him out perfectly there. And then one last clip of Bryce I'm going to show you from this podcast it really just shows how dumb Bryce is, man. Again, he's just like, I didn't mean to hurt anyone's feelings. But he doesn't think like he's wrong. Like he thinks what he said is just out of context. And people don't understand what he's trying to say. When we do understand what you're trying to say and you're wrong.
Said what I said, but
and we can move
I
past
believe that if I would have said everything that I said in a historical context and talked like a history teacher and just been much more sensitive to people's feelings, I believe that I could have said the words that I said and not offended people. And I didn't mean to offend people, bro. If I would have known that people was literally going to get mad at what I said, I wouldn't have said it, I promise. But it's too late. And like I said, I don't think he's a good guy. I made it very clear.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. So
there you go. If I knew I was going to hurt everyone's feelings, I wouldn't have said it. If I could have said it like a historical context, what historical context would make fishing with Adolf? I mean, that should be his podcast name. What would make that okay? There's nothing that would make that okay. He just doesn't understand because he's super low IQ and uneducated, and it's really bad. Luckily, they didn't let him go crazy on this podcast about that particular topic to make himself look even worse to a point where it was going to drum up more controversy. Would it have been slightly more interesting if Bryce could go on a diatribe and make himself look dumber? Would it be even better content for this channel? Yes. But instead of letting him do that, they cut him off and say, look, man, you shouldn't be saying these types of things. You shouldn't be humanizing these types of people. It's offensive. It's, historically wrong. You're using information that you were brainwashed with that isn't necessarily true to humanize a person that's an utter and complete piece of shit. And you don't even realize it because you're nothing more than a useful idiot. Again, there's people who want Bryce to say these things because they believe in it and they want to see somebody of a celebrity status, not that Bryce is a huge celebrity, espouse these beliefs so they can help amplify them and normalize them. They're just using Bryce as a useful idiot. Now, in terms of them taking down the podcast, so they took down this podcast. Obviously, the internet is forever. Do I think they should have took down the podcast? No, I do not. I think they handled it pretty okay. I think calling out Bryce, I would have been more aggressive. If that was me, I would have been more aggressive. I'd be like, Bryce, how fucking stupid are you? What grade level did you make it to in school? Did you get a high school diploma? Not that a high school diploma is the end all be all for anyone. You could be educated without that, but just curious to kind of dig into Bryce's education that he thinks this. What are your, he says, I've done my own research. Well, what's your research? Give me your research on this so I can go check it out. I guarantee he would provide some bullshit. I mean, he does think the earth is flat despite us having plenty of images of a round earth. But ultimately, I don't think they should have taken it down. There's people talking about, oh, well, they didn't like all the criticisms they were getting in comments. Maybe that is the case. Maybe that is the reason why. But at the end of the day, it's their podcast. If they want to take it down, they can take it down. And Rampage posted a video explaining why they took it down. Now, you can take this for whatever you want. This is a 20-minute video. Basically, Rampage explains that it was the comments, but it wasn't necessarily criticism of them. Listen to this.
If you have bad PR, like some of the shit that you just don't want to make shit worse. So Bear was actually looking out for him, and then Bear deleted the podcast, not because of him looking bad or the comments by him, because he said it was a lot of racist comments and stuff on there. He was saying a lot of racist shit. Sorry, guys, I'm sick as fuck. He was saying a lot of racist shit. I mean, they were saying a lot of racist shit in the comments. And a lot of fans saying racist shit, and that's not right. That's why he...
So, it wouldn't shock me if that was true. I'm not saying that that's untrue. And Rampage does go on later in this video to say he would have just turned off the comments, and that's what they should have done. But I think that would have drummed up more controversy. But I also do believe they probably didn't want to give the Nazi sympathizers essentially a forum on the video to be like, man, Bryce is based, man. Bryce is speaking facts, because that's what they would have done. And I understand not wanting to platform that and not wanting to get caught up in that controversy in general and having to manage all those comments because people find tricky ways of kind of getting around the auto moderation of YouTube. And so they probably just said, you know what, we're going to delete the whole video. Now, it could have been because they didn't like the criticism. For me personally, I'm sure I'll get plenty of criticism from these type of people on this video, but I don't care. But also on top of it, what I've noticed when you tweet about this, when you make a video about this, and you're at all critical of Bryce Mitchell, man, these people who support the type of ideology that Bryce is espousing recently, when they hear someone regurgitate their brain rot, what they do is they're like flies on shit. They'll be on this video immediately commenting, complaining, saying ridiculous stuff. So I'll take Rampage at his word. There probably was some racist stuff because typically these people who love Adolf were also racist and homophobes and whatever else you want to throw in there. But so I don't truly know, but I don't think they should have deleted it. They should have just turned off the comments at the bare minimum, or had someone or a couple people trying to mod the comments or make the comments approval only. I think you can. But let me know what you guys think down in the comments. I'm very curious. I think Bryce is just really, really dumb, really, really low IQ, and a useful idiot for the people who actually believe these types of things. And I think the podcast overall, I think the guy was just trying to stop Bryce from putting his foot in his mouth. And people don't like that because it would have generated a viral moment. And so a lot of people are being super critical. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and thank you so much for watching.